Fantastic.
Well
All
done.
right, good stuff.
There we are.
Hello. Brilliant. Okay. All right, so we're recording and we're a couple of minutes into the session. So yeah, anyone who wants to be part of the recording with their camera on or off, completely up to you. Brilliant. Welcome to this session. Just to remind you where you are, in case you weren't entirely sure, we're in a session called Our Changing Landscape, where we're going to be talking about lots of the tensions currently underway. We're grappling with what on earth we do with our uplands in particular, but with our landscape in general. We've got a really interesting panel to talk about that with you from a really diverse set of perspectives. But before I go into who they are, as brilliant people as they are, I'm sure everyone in this room has their own brilliance. So I'm going to introduce the session and we'll move into breakout rooms to begin with. But first I'll just introduce you. So the aim of this session, one of the aims, is to be working together to thrash out something of a vision for the upland landscape within the context of climate and economic uncertainty. What we're trying to bring into focus is the potential and the difficulty in imagining and implementing multifunctional and integrated land uses for the benefit of all society. This is first and foremost a thinking out loud session. So we're all coming to the session with our own expertise, our own interests, and also our own biases. And throughout the session, we'll be teasing these out into the open for good inspection and hopefully some healthy debate. To get a bit of an idea of who we have in the room, I've got a poll lined up. Helena, could you launch that now? Brilliant. And I'm just going to keep talking and you can answer while I'm here. Just curious as to who we have in the room today and where you are as a decision maker in this frame. So just to give you a bit of information about myself, I am presenting the session as me, Finn Weddell, and I'm also representing it on behalf of a small group of individuals from Scotland who are aspiring to put on a Scottish real farming conference in coming years. We put on a couple of other sessions during this conference. Yesterday there was one about land reform and the process of land reform as it's taking place in Scotland and the vision that's there. We also had one, I think last week, about the Scottish policy context, how the Scottish Agriculture Bill reflects what's going on here, as opposed to the other agriculture bill that was very big in the media. And we also had a session on agroforestry, which didn't come together just in time, but we've got a lot of energy for that as well. So that's why we're here at the Northern Real Farming Conference to contribute our Scottish perspectives. And I'm there as a self-directed student in integrated land management, having worked for the Permaculture Association in Scotland for a number of years. And as of this year, also representing the conservation charity Reforesting Scotland as a director. So now I'm just going to let you in on how I'm seeing this session playing out. It's up for a bit of flexibility because we've not rehearsed it. I don't know how long exactly all the different bits will fit together, how long it will last and fit together. We're going to start off by heading into breakout rooms to discuss a couple of starter questions to get people going. And in the breakout space, you'll all have access to something called a Jamboard. And I'll just include the link in the chat now, and I'll explain it in a little bit more detail in a moment. Let me do that. Ping. Okay, you should all see that in the chat. And you should probably open that now as well, because you won't be able to see it in a few minutes when you are in the breakout space. So if you can copy and paste it into your browser or just copy it and save it for later, yeah, otherwise it will disappear. So following the breakout space, we'll come back into one big room. We'll distill the breakout conversations into one big space. And then we'll be hearing from the panel, who each have a short presentation of their work and their vision in practical integrated land use in the uplands. And there'll be an opportunity to ask questions after that. And then we'll be moving towards the home straight with a big whole room discussion spurred on by a particular question being, how can we overcome the barriers, particularly the cultural barriers to integrating land uses, and eventually wrapping up with some closing comments. So a nice small question to be leading us towards the end of the session. So let's just have a little look at the poll. I'm not sure how I see. So we have got a very good mix of people here today. We have at least three farmers, 2 conservation land managers, an other land manager, and I don't know what other that could be, perhaps a forest manager. There is some people with it who are a combination of the above, and actually most people are none of the above, neither land managers, land owners, of any sort, which is interesting. So just over half the group, just under half the group. Okay, so that's who we've got here today, and I'm assuming everyone here has a particular interest in the uplands. And as we're in the Northern Real Farming Conference, this is why we propose this in particular, because a huge amount of what we have to deal with is upland landscape, and there's a lot of parity between Northern England and many parts of Scotland. Although some would say it gets more rugged, more harsh as we go further north, but it's not always the case. So brilliant. I'm going to start with the Jamboard now. So like I said, open it up yourself, but I'm just going to give you a bit of a demonstration of what the Jamboard looks like and how to use it. So I'm going to share my screen. Where are we? There we go. So if you've clicked the link, this is where you should find yourselves, on a Jamboard that looks like this. And you'll see up at the top, there's 10 frames, and that's just one frame per breakout room. So judging by the number of people we have here, we'll probably have about 5 breakout rooms. So if you're in breakout room 1, you can use panel number 1, and if breakout room 2, you can use panel number 2, etc., etc. They're all identical. So there's just a couple of questions here to get things started. You'll be in a room of about 4 people, and you'll have an opportunity to discuss this openly, and you'll have 4 minutes for each question. So you could divide that up as about 60 seconds per person per question if you want to be very anal about it, or you can just kind of open it to the floor of your room. There'll be no particular facilitator in your space. We'll try and organize it so there's one of each of the panel in each room, because that would be a nice spread, but we won't necessarily be playing the role of facilitators. We're just everyday bods that are in your room. So question number 1 to answer for 4 minutes is, what potential do you think our northern uplands have? And question number 2 is, what do we really need from the upland landscape in these challenging times? The challenging times being in the context of coronavirus and all that poses in terms of economic insecurity, but also the challenges our rural communities face at the moment, with disintegration and lack of resilience in the supply chains, and climate change, biodiversity, these kind of big issues at the moment. So yeah, we'll have 8 minutes in all in the rooms, and then we'll be coming back into the main room. Can anyone just put up their hand or put something in the chat now if they do not feel clear on what's going to happen in a couple of seconds?
Just say, Finn, I'll share the Jamboard as well in the breakout room, so everyone will have access to that link again, just in case they miss it.
Fabulous. All right, thanks, Helena. Yeah, okay. If no one's got any issues, then yeah, Helena, if you could break us out into rooms of about 4, and we will head on. I hope everyone had really good conversations there. Ours was definitely, we got interrupted mid-flow, so that's a good sign. Yeah, I'd be interested now to hear a little bit about what came out of some of those sessions. So I don't know who was in each one, so I can't name anyone to represent your room. So just if you're comfortable to do so, unmute yourself and just come forward and tell us what was talked about in your group, in your room. I'm going to have to pick out names if no one does it
Yeah, hello, Finn.
Tony.
Hello, Finn.
Hey, Patrick.
Hello. So I think I was in room 3, and I'm afraid we went a bit off-piste, despite your questions. We took the idea that actually the uplands are quite varied, and it was quite important for us all to maybe just initially get a grasp, given that we're 5 minutes into this, get a grasp on where we'd all come from and what our backgrounds were. And actually, yeah, you run a poll at the beginning of this, but I think, yeah, the conversation we had over the last few minutes confirmed that we were all from different backgrounds and got experience of a wide area of different parts of uplands. So yeah, I'm sorry we went rogue, but I found that useful.
All right, thanks a lot, Patrick.
I'm happy to talk for room 2. We also go sort of like presented ourselves and realized that we're coming from different parts. And I think that the main takeaway that we took is that there's great potential, and because of the people there, because of the social component, because of the environmental component, because of the business component, there's potential in all things. And the challenge is going to be managing conflict between all these potential things that are needing attention there. If someone else from the group wants to say something else, just
do they? If not, I can say something about room 1. We put together a long list of things that the uplands can provide, and we think the tensions, any that are at the moment, are largely to do with society and the economic and social structures there at the moment, and that all of the potential benefits that we can get from the uplands are completely compatible with each other if we can change the way that society manages the uplands, and it'll get away from the silo use of land at the moment to something that's much more integrated with many more people involved. And Andrew made the point that we want people to be living in the uplands and managing them sustainably for a huge range of outputs that they're really not producing at the moment.
Awesome, thanks a lot, Helen. Sounds like a good group to be in. So we've heard from room 1, 2, and 3, I think. Helena, was there a room 5? There were just 4. All right, well, I was in room 4. Would anyone, either of you guys want to speak up? Or if not, that's fine.
Yeah, well, we talked about just the importance of diversity in the landscape and the value of that, physical diversity, but economic activity that permits, and the way that promotes, I guess, different social structures and more vibrancy in communities, if you can achieve that. And some of the barriers that are there to that, like you can't get tree planting grants in Orkney, for instance. And that was, and I guess some of the tensions almost, I don't think we named it as such, but talking about the need to look at, in that diversity, don't have sort of one-off, just sort of block solutions like we're just going to plant massive conifers here or have native woodland everywhere. There needs to be more flexibility than that, more subtlety and more diversity. Brilliant,
thanks, Alan. That's perfect. That actually wraps us up just in time for the next section. So yeah, I really love that. What everyone brought back to the main room there. Definitely a lot of the main issues coming up, and the reason it just really kind of sings to me why we brought the session to this conference. I'm hearing a lot of resonance throughout the room that you know, there's a huge amount of expectation perhaps that the landscape will provide. And often from the policymakers that the rural landscape will provide certain services to maybe more urbanized populations, and that these landscapes need to be stewarded, and they need to be stewarded in integrated ways, and we can't divide up these different land uses and just designate one piece of land for this and one piece of land for that, because that doesn't work for communities, it doesn't work for economies. And so this talk of integrated land use, it might not be particularly new for anyone at a real farming conference, but it's really important to get down into the details of what that really looks like in practice, which is why we've put together this panel. So we're going to move on to presentations. And first of all, I'm going to offer you Andrew Barber. Andrew, do you want to put your hand up to say you're okay with your presentation, and I'll introduce you?
Yeah, hello, how do you do? I think do I stick it up on my screen and you can turn my screen on, or do you run it
yeah,
from your end? How does it?
If you're okay with it, I'll introduce you, and then you can do share screen at the bottom of your Zoom thing, and then you can go into your presentation.
I don't
right,
see
so
share screen on my end. Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I beg your pardon. Sorry.
All right, cool.
Yeah, okay, on you go.
All right, so Andrew Barber is a forester cum farmer who's going to share with us the work he's done to integrate farming and forestry on his farm in Highland, Perthshire. He was the chairman of the Scottish Government's Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, which reported back in 2010, looking at the ambitions of government to expand forestry. And he was more recently part of the Deer Working Group, which has just recently reported to Scottish Government, looking at the nefarious deer issue, which in Scotland is big talk among conservationists, and I think in Northern England too. So Andrew, yes, so you can now share screen and tell us a little bit about your agroforestry.
Hello, everyone, and can folks see that screen now? Can everyone see a screen?
Nope.
Does that make sense to anyone?
No, we can't see it,
see
Andrew.
that? Right, well, I don't know what to do. Hang on.
Andrew, when you click share screen, you'll get a window which shows all the windows that are open on your computer. If you just click the one that you want and press share.
Gosh. No, I'm not seeing it. Share computer sound.
Yeah, well, I've got a copy which
sorry,
I'll try and load up
this is
as
my
well.
fault, I'm sure. Basic advanced files, whiteboard. I'm not seeing it at all on my screen, I'm afraid.
Is your presentation already open in a different window? That would help.
We have a problem. Your sound was breaking up there for me, I'm afraid. Is it share?
Is the presentation?
You are sharing. You can see my screen now, can you? No, you can't.
Yes, we can see your screen. You just need to open up the presentation.
Sorry, I'm stuck here. You can see my screen. Yeah. So can you see that now? No.
Yep.
Can you see a set of slides?
It's just opening up. Perfect.
Can you see that? Tell me when you can see a slide with writing on it.
Yeah, got it.
All good.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, well, I'll go for it, and you must shout at me if either it disappears or, well, if it doesn't make sense, shout at me definitely. But we've already heard today that word integration be used umpteen times, and you can't move within the policy world without finding that word. And we know the reasons why, we've discussed it, so I won't take a lot of time about it, but it's often the case that we are talking about that because we feel it's not happening on the ground. In fact, many of our landscapes look like landscapes which haven't integrated well with other interests, other needs. So the issue about trees and farming is an old one, and agroforestry is the in phrase, but you could, different terms have covered it. And so I want to just talk briefly about this at home, the farm at home, which is on the southern end of the Cairngorms. You're looking into them there, as you can maybe see. It's a beef sheep enterprise. But you can see a plantation at the back of the house, and we have others too. It's, whoops, I've gone too fast. It's a landscape which is a mixed landscape, but traditional landscape with trees in one place and sheep and animals in another landscape. You'll be familiar with the scene. shelter belts and plantations and whatnot. And we spend as farmers most of the time thinking about these animals here and grass, how to grow grass. And but as I said, we're also growing trees. So invariably our stock at times get into the trees, fences break. And over the years, one thing we absolutely know is that cattle like trees. And as I'm sure everyone in this group knows, cattle are really woodland animals. They're woodland edge animals, and they use trees when they can get into them. They use them a lot. We're also probably used to this, and we normally see it as a problem, but sheep also use trees in particular ways and as browse as well, and that's normally seen as a problem. But the trees, as we know, while I was still thinking about the interaction with trees and animals, alter the microclimate of the ground on which they're growing. And you can easily see ways that this benefits the animals. And essentially what it does is lengthen the growing season for the plants underneath, for the field layer, for the grass underneath the trees in the autumn and in the spring, so that your grass grows longer, but it tends to depress the field layer growth in the summertime when there's a strong, if there's a strong canopy cover. And we kind of all know that. But it's really a key point from the farmer's point of view. Trees also have their needs, and we probably all know that, particularly in a windy environment, they need other trees round about them if you're going to establish them easily. And particularly if you want to grow timber. So we took these things that were in our mind, and some 10, 15 years ago when we were planning new shelter belt replacements, it really occurred to us that we could use these attributes of trees and how livestock like to use trees and create what we saw as a new wood pasture system. So what you would call agroforestry today. We came up with a design in the Glen at home where we were wanting to move towards about a 50% tree cover, and we were wanting to grow oak. But the problem we had thinking about shelter belts is that we weren't going to grow enough oak to make it sensible from a marketing point of view, from a timber point of view. But we didn't want to plant lots of ground under trees because we would lose too much grazing. Usual problem a farmer faces. Foresters don't think that way, but farmers do think that way. So we came up with this kind of pattern, which was an alley planting pattern that you can see in its early days, and essentially the strips of trees with grass in between. And here it is on a little bit further. And what it does is it has the characteristics of an ordinary woodland in the middle of these strips. So the trees are tightly grown, so they grow up straight and true, hopefully. But it also has a huge amount of edge habitat, and that from a biodiversity point of view is extremely good. It maintains a field layer through, which is good for the biodiversity, the field layer, and for the animals. Here you can see it maybe a bit better there. So you have, in this case, it's oak grown in center lines and other species that can coppice grown on the outside. And this, you can see a bit of alder there and other such species. Then you stick in animals, and the animals, you're really treating this like a herb-rich pasture, and right through the farm we rotationally graze. So you put in animals in short bursts, and the sheep here have done quite a good high prune exercise. The trees are past the stage of being damaged, which sheep are perfectly capable of doing, as we all know, but you're treating this as a hybrid between a herb-rich pasture and a woodland. And that's important from a biodiversity point of view, because you've maintained the field layer, you get the chance for plants to grow. Here are some globe flowers which previously under a set stocking regime disappeared, but under this wood pasture system are now flowering and expanding as a result. And the cattle also come in once the trees are up in size. So this is heifers on 10 years old. This is older, growing on a wetter end of the site. And as I said, this is just a great habitat from the cattle point of view, but it's also capable of growing useful timber. And that brings me to the timber point. Our aim has always been to try and utilize timber on the farm, and it's we invested a couple of decades ago in a wee bandsaw mill, really with the aim of using wind-blown timber and timber around the farm to try and add some value to it. And of course, it's immediately become a bit of a community hub, if you can use that word. Here are two neighbours who've both used the saw for their own interests and purposes. So that's important. The product side of things is very important to us. And this is also about maintaining employment. There's a shepherd there on the left and another one on the right, but they both work in those woods and they are the next generation. So that's what this word integration has meant to us in the context of trees, wildlife and farming and people. That's enough from me. I'll hand back.
Great, Andrew. There's an end screen share somewhere at the top of your screen. There should be. There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Did everyone
Andrew.
see that?
Yeah,
you're most welcome.
I want to move swiftly on to the other presentations, but there are a couple of very specific questions to you right now, and a couple of the classic agroforestry questions. So perhaps you could field those just before we go into Patrick's presentation. The two questions are, could you comment on planting density? And there's one about coppicing, but we'll just take two questions. So could you comment on planting density and how many years growth have trees had before the livestock get in?
Tree density, there was effectively a 5-foot planting spacing, so quite tight in the alleys, but at the whole hectare, it was 1,600 trees a hectare. That was rather more than we would have ideally wanted, but we were stuck with the grant design at the time. So trees grown relatively tightly in the tree alleys. And when will we start coppicing? I think it'll probably be, the outside trees will almost certainly be going for a firewood market. We'll also coppice some of the oak and free grow the remaining trees into timber dimensions, grow them as fast as we can. So the ones we're growing on for timber, we will aim to get about a 3-meter clear bull on, 3 to 4 meter, and that we'll probably be getting close to that in about 10 years' time. So I think it'll be about 20 years that we start the coppice cycle, 20 to 25.
And letting the animals in?
Sheep went in here at, I think it was about 5 years old. Trees had established well. They were past being pushed over by the sheep, and the leaders were well above browse height. And cattle went in at 10 years old. And our experience elsewhere has shown that providing you don't leave animals in for a long time, and you're careful on one or two key points, these trees are really quite robust within a livestock system. It depends what else the animals have got to eat. And it's a slightly complex issue, but the people who say you can't grow trees and animals together because the animals will damage the trees are just doing it wrong, in my less than humble opinion.
Brilliant, thanks Andrew. The only reason I wanted to quickly fire through those is because the session isn't intended to go into the details of agroforestry, and that might have been covered in other sessions, but those are some of the common questions that often come up when agroforestry is talked about, so I thought it'd be good to just quickly snipe them off. So I hope that Aylwin, Norrie and Robert, I hope you feel like your questions have been answered. And brilliant, there's one more message, but yeah, like I say, if the details of agroforestry come out later on in the conversation, then great. But for now, we'll move into Patrick's presentation. So just to introduce Patrick, he is a farmer and conservationist. Patrick has worked extensively with the Heather Trust, promoting integrated moorland management for a variety of land uses across the UK uplands, including agriculture, peatland, renewables, and field sports. He's also worked with the Soil Association Scotland to deliver their Farming with Nature programme, Alongside his current work as an independent moorland management consultant, he now manages the Galloway Hills Network, a project to promote diverse and sustainable upland farming in southwest Scotland. And his herd of pedigree Galloway cattle have also played their role in a variety of black grouse and curlew conservation projects since 2015. So Patrick, handing over to you, and the stage is yours.
Thanks, Finn. I have had exactly Andrew's problem. I just can't. I'm using a borrowed laptop and I just can't get this to work. So I sent you the presentation earlier. I wonder, there's only 4 slides. If you wouldn't mind just you sharing your screen and clicking through on it, if you've got a moment on that.
There we go.
Grand. So this is only a relatively simple rush through because it was put together. The last few days have been extremely busy. But yeah, my name's Patrick, and as Finn has said, my background is in, we're back to the same word again, integrated land management, particularly working with the Heather Trust over 8 years. Effectively, 10 years ago, we were looking at, particularly with grouse moor management, we were looking at very, very single-minded land management, and there was a demand to get people to sort of diversify, broaden their portfolios. A lot of farming was being carried out on grouse moors to specifically augment or improve the sporting objectives, and actually now it's been really encouraging from having a farming background to be able to actually support grouse moors now to be producing actually thriving, practical in their own right, 4-square farm businesses, not to deliver sporting objectives. Also, that's been useful to get farmers into monetizing some aspects of grouse stocks. It's been also interesting to get farming involved with renewable energy. It's also been interesting to basically marry together land uses which have traditionally been quite polarized. So yeah, and then I worked with Soil Association. I was involved with the South of Scotland Golden Eagle project, which was an ongoing project. My role was specifically liaising with farmers, landowners, gamekeepers, and making sure that they were basically kept up to date with how the project was working. I work with SNH's new project, collaborative project called Working for Waders, which tries to place a value on the importance of local knowledge and trying to make sure that, having identified that effectively scientific guidance coming through on some of these conservation practices, a lot is lost in translation between the paper that's published on conservation of X, Y, and Z species and actually delivering, actually turning that into action. So Working for Waders is quite good at kind of finding that middle ground between sort of pure science, pure research into what actually works, what's actually going to get traction on the ground. I'm on the steering group of the Scottish Nature Friendly Farming Network, which is a useful way to sort of pull ideas and connect up the work I'm doing specifically in Galloway with a wider picture across Scotland. And I started the Galloway Hills Network, which is an attempt to try and connect landowners across Galloway, farmers and landowners across Galloway. Galloway being one of the most heavily forested or afforested areas since the Second World War. Now, there's still a lot of hill farming going on in Galloway, but it's incredibly fragmented. There's little people working on projects here and there, but logistically, it's very difficult to get your head around some of the distances in Galloway now that I'm working on a 1,600-acre hill farm here, and we're surrounded on all sides by, well, when you take in all of our neighbours, it's 35,000 acres of commercial Sitka spruce, and that's sort of 70s, 80s, 1970s, 1980s era stuff. So that's not mixed. That's solid Sitka spruce. And so coming back to, maybe this has inspired my interest in integrated land management, is basically getting the crappy end of the stick on that and realizing that the decisions that my neighbours have made mean that I can no longer deliver my objectives in some ways, particularly to do with conservation. And the idea too that we need to be working across landholdings. Some of the sort of the fallout of those 1970s, 1980s land use changes now are telling even now. They'll be telling in my grandchildren's sort of era. So I'm keen now that as we start to revisit some of this rapid expansion of forest creation in the southwest of Scotland, I'm keen to make sure we don't basically fall down the same problems that we caused in the 70s and 80s. I'm sorry, this is probably rather biography heavy, but I also have a very, very dear herd of Galloway cattle that I'm absolutely obsessed with. I've started that 5-6 years ago. I don't know, Finn, if you can bring up, there's a photograph there that's a bit of a talisman for me. I've taking on the grazing on a couple of triple SIs. I'm selling, there's a demand for more cattle grazing. We see it quite often in policy, but actually quite a lot of what I'm doing is trying to turn that into practice. What does it actually look like when you've had cattle off the hill for 30 years? How do you actually get them back on? Quite a lot of what I've been doing is basically troubleshooting and running case studies across Galloway, trying to make sure that Galloway cattle, which globally, internationally, some of the most famous cattle in the world, are actually prospering in Galloway. They do very well in other parts of the country, but the landscape which created them 150 years ago almost doesn't exist anymore. So the view there on the front page of my presentation is part of a triple SI that I'm grazing, which hadn't had grazing for 40 years. SNH then said, oh God, the reason it was designated was because of its breeding hen harriers and its golden eagles. Then as a result of almost having lost those after 40 years without management, because there's been a huge amount of bracken expansion and an awful lot of white Molinia grass, which has led to, when we had botanists surveying this area before I started the project, they said actually it's in a pretty terrible condition after 40 years without any management. We need to resurrect some of this management. It's a sort of a strange 1970s idea that if something's working really well, you need to wrap it in cotton wool, change the management of it, and do something different with it. So this was sort of proto rewilding, and then trying to build cattle back into it. Finn asked me to put together kind of a vision for sort of a case for the sustainability of hill farming in the uplands. Through Galloway Hills Network, I speak to lots of people who are interested in doing lots of interesting stuff with their farms, but I think probably the narrative that I get most often that comes through is that the gap between lowland productive farming and hill farming is getting wider and wider and wider, and it becomes it's making less and less sense as the years go by, for the two to kind of compete, for the two to try to be doing the same things. And I think there needs to become a point, a lot of people already accepted this, but there needs to come a point in the mainstream where we draw a line under the fact these are two different things, and actually we can deliver very different objectives if we start to think differently about what we're doing in the hills versus what we're doing in the lowlands. That's not to say that the hills don't play a part in terms of food production and in terms of many of the things we traditionally expect from farmers, but also the uplands offer opportunities for all kinds of different interests. I've listed there things like carbon sequestration, water quality, flood management, biodiversity, tourism. There's the uplands are challenging, but also present lots of unique opportunities. So in canvassing opinion across a particular area of Scotland over the last year or 18 months, I think there's loads of potential, but I think we just probably need to stop trying to make a square peg fit into a round hole. And that was one of the narratives that came out from my work at Soil Association, which was about identifying farming practices which are a win-win for farming and nature, win-win for farming and conservation. So stuff that actually works for everybody, rather than constantly. I was born in 1985. I was brought up in a landscape which seemed to be almost constantly lose-lose for farming and nature. So turning that around, I think, would be a nice start. And that's not exactly what I was asked to give you to start the conversation with, but I hope that's useful.
Brilliant, Patrick. I absolutely love that. It was really nice to get a full vision of the way you've seen and interacted with Galloway over the years, and I just want to say your cows are beautiful. It's a very stunning herd. If anyone has any questions about what Patrick's doing, this would be a good time to throw them in. Otherwise, we will be moving on to the next presenter. Elwyn, you can also unmute yourself to ask a question if you'd like, or comment. Elwyn's put a comment in the chat saying, really interesting point about being an island of farm in amongst miles of forest.
Hi, yeah, thanks Patrick, that was a really interesting talk. Yeah, and I like the fact that you said that, because I'm equally worried about it. So we're in Angus, and Glen Clover, the closest glen to us, is planted now down to it's a tiny wee road, and the road, that's loved for tourists, is planted right down to the road, quite a long breadth of Glen Clover, and it's going to completely change the character of the landscape. And I know that the way that the Forestry Commission are pushing for more planting, I mean, just on our farm, we're looking at a plan for working with the RSPB to improve the opportunities for wetland birds that we've got a lot of. But we've also been looking at just doing one strip of forestry planting, and it's just a bit of a worry. And the point you made about, I think maybe it was actually the previous speaker who said that foresters they're not thinking about what a farmer needs, and they're also not thinking about what a conservationist needs, really. So just trying to combine those is difficult. So I suppose that's not a question, it's a comment. But thank you for saying what you said.
Brilliant, thanks, Elwyn. That's really well articulated and good. Yeah, great to hear parallel story happening over in Angus and what you've observed. And we've got a couple more comments coming in. Again, if you have comments that you want to put in the chat, you can also unmute yourself and say them out loud if you'd like to start the conversation. We'll just take one more out loud. But Norrie or Jane, whoever gets there first. Oh, there's another one coming in.
Wanted to say that, sorry, I'll put the video on just so you know. Come on, there you go. I thought both speakers are really very interesting, and they both had points to make. I mean, I heard on the radio the other day, James Dyson talking, he owns 35,000 acres of farmland in England. But he's not a farmer, he's a producer, a manufacturer. And this bit about forestry comes to the same thing. Monoculture forests are really not the answer because they're not biodiverse. They don't really host much in the way of wildlife. And I really thought what Andrew said was the way he's gone about it is a much better way. But control over the Forestry Commission is really going to, or Forestry Scotland as it now is going to be key into how Scotland expands its tree growth, but expands it in a way that it creates jobs, creates biodiversity, regenerates wildlife. I understand Paul's interest in, Patrick's interest in working with wildlife, but I'm just concerned that there's a much broader view, and as he says, he doesn't want to be a strip in amongst forests, does he? Sorry, that's all I've got to say.
No, Norrie, one thing that's interesting about Galloway particularly is that a lot of the forest expansion that's taking place is in state-owned 350 square miles of state-owned Forestry Commission Galloway Forest Park. And I suppose, not being jaded, not wanting to put a bum note on it, Scottish Government through Forestry Commission has got a fantastic opportunity to really do some cool stuff and set the standard for private foresters. And yet it's just not really happening. And traditionally, when this area was bought over, there was a system of crofts and small farms right the way through that were bought up in those 350 square miles. In the last 10 years, they're now all derelict. And a lot of the former in-buy that would have been used for those crofts is now being planted. And it's weird. It feels to me rather like a missed opportunity, because there's no question we need this timber production. It's important. But we've got a really good case study, a really good test scenario for how we do this. And instead of sort of setting the bar for private foresters to follow, quite often it's being used more for its secondary purpose, which is basically to manage the market and control the prices. Yeah, I would say they're a good deal, Forestry Commission often a good deal better than private foresters, but at the same time they are more motivated by the bottom line than you'd expect them to, maybe as a state agent. So anyway, I can see this topple over the whole conversation. I see Finn getting all sweaty. Sorry, I'll shut up.
You're quite right, because it's ownership of land, whether it's housing development, whether it's farming, whether it's all about the people with the money making the money, ultimately. It's not about the landscape. It's not about putting the best houses on. Sorry, I'm diversifying into one of my subject matters as well, but it's the issue we have, isn't it?
All right, guys. Well, thanks so much. It's really interesting, and it does tie into the session that I was hosting yesterday alongside the Scottish Land Commission and an estate owner in Fife which was all about land reform, and it was talking a lot about the land reform process as it has taken place in Scotland and continues to unfold, but it was aimed to be relevant to anyone in England and Wales as well. So if you're interested in kind of the bigger kind of meta picture of land ownership, land management, and how communities are integrated into those, yeah, it was a very, very related session to this, and I'd recommend when the recordings are up to going back and watching that, because we talked about regulation of land values and all these sorts of things as well. But thanks for bringing that up here. It's really, really relevant. We've had a couple of comments as well, just to say, Jane Cooper mentioned it has to be the right tree in the right place, which is the strapline for Reforesting Scotland, the charity I work for, well, I'm a director for. And there's also a small discussion about more cattle, less sheep, or perhaps more primitive breeds of sheep. And there's been a couple more comments since I've read them, but I haven't had a chance. But we'll be moving on now, and the chat's there for everyone to check in with. And if you want to continue the conversation there, go for it. That's fine. But we have one more presentation to delve into now, which comes from a different angle. So we started off with forestry trained farmer Andrew. We have conservationist and farmer Patrick, and now we have Alan, who has worked mostly in conservation and less so in farming. So Alan is a conservation manager at Trees for Life, which is an ambitious rewilding charity in the Scottish Highlands, which focuses on bringing about ecological regeneration and involving volunteers in practical action to restore habitats and species. Beyond Trees for Life, much of Alan's work is about looking for a sustainable balance between the needs of nature, business, and people's quality of life, and demonstrating that the skills, knowledge, and livelihoods in today's landscapes are the basis for the future. So, Andrew, I'm handing over to you, and hopefully you can get your presentation set up.
Yep, thanks, Finn. I can manage that. There we go. Okay, hi everybody. I can't move my slide. Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Finn. As you said, I'm conservation manager at Trees for Life, and we're a rewilding charity, and that word brings us into all kinds of fun conversations about what we are and who we might be threatening or otherwise with that term rewilding. And I just wanted to start with our definition of that, because I don't think there is a commonly established definition as to what rewilding is. Hopefully you can make this out here. We want to rewild the Scottish Highlands, enable the restoration of the Caledonian forest, and integral to our success is the involvement of people. And at that, so we're at kind of that end of the rewilding spectrum, involving people in what we do and focused on there being relevance in the outcomes of rewilding for people. So whilst nature is absolutely central to that, and nature finding its own way into the landscape, that needs to happen with people if it's to be sustainable. So, and I really want to talk about one of our main projects to try and turn that talk into walk, and that's this proposal I've been working on called East West Wild. That is a fuzzy map on my screen, so I hope it's vaguely comprehensible to yourselves. Waft my hand around. Just off the east side here, this is about, Inverness is about 15 miles away. Just off the west coast here, this is Skye. So this is 660 square miles of the Highlands. There are 4 glens there: Glenafric, Glenshiel, Glenmoriston, Glencanach. There are 15 Munros there. In total, there is more native pine wood there than there is in the rest of Scotland. And that is about 55 significant landholdings within that landscape. It's a landscape that we see as environmentally degraded after centuries of grazing, and also a landscape where there's a lot of polarization between the stakeholders in there. Much of that land is deer stalking ground, but there's also a fair bit of the land there dedicated to conservation as well. About 11% of the landholding of that land is given to conservation, and there are communities, small communities within there as well. And you can probably imagine that some of the conversations we have as conservationists involve a lot of conflict with deer, and therefore a lot of the relationships in there have been very strained. So whilst it's natural for us, an organisation like us, to have real ecological aspirations for this landscape, and this project was particularly inspired by Trees for Life's long-held ambition to recognise the idea of a corridor connecting through Glen Affric from Loch Ness in the east over to Loch Duch in the west. That vision never really got anywhere because of those relationships. And so this project is our attempt to square that off, to resolve those issues, and to find a genuinely long-term sustainable way forward. And that's really about giving equal place to nature, people and business within a vision of the future, and seeing that those are three legs of the same stool. They all, sooner or later, will need each other. They won't survive on their own. So that's I guess our key guiding principle to this project. That, alongside the fact that we feel you can achieve more together as a partnership, collaborating together on an agenda developed out of that, than you can by acting alone. And that means then getting into those relationships and making them work for all involved. So really what we've said is that if you whether you call it restoring this landscape ecologically, or you want to call it rewilding, or use whatever term you're most comfortable with, but that return of nature can be the catalyst for social and economic regeneration here. This landscape has just 2,300 people in it, which, when you think about it, is pretty staggering given the scale of what's there and given the past populations it would have had at different points in history. And just to give a wee flavour of that, some comparisons with Southwest Norway. Provinces in Southwest Norway all having higher population densities than is the case in the Highlands, and partly related to that, incomes in West Norway from farming are significantly higher than they would be in a landscape like this, with about the same subsidy regimes. So that's just one indication, we feel, of the extra potential that this landscape has. And we think there is huge potential to build on some existing livelihoods and income activities in this landscape into the future, if you base that on the landscape regenerating. So we're thinking there about, basically we've done detailed work to scope out some of those ideas in more in the round, and with more evidence behind it. So looking particularly at nature-based tourism, including stuff that's already based on sporting activity, and how you could deliver more income from that if you had a real story of wildlife surging back here. Carbon and ecosystem services through native woodland creation, mixed woodland creation, and through peatland conservation. Forestry in different forms, and those that were just being discussed, nature-friendly forestry and productive broadleaf type approaches that can generate income for small businesses that can be based in this local economy where the income circulates locally. So you have the sticky money thing happening. Farming, regenerative grazing, wild grazing, and wild food and marketing, processing that stuff locally so you can sell it within your own markets and further afield. And perhaps also in small renewable energy, increasing interest, including we've recently had one of the entrepreneurs of British solar energy move into this landscape and take a real interest in this project. So small solar, micro hydro, wind as well, and the possibility for local energy distribution networks. That's where we see some of the ways you can link this environmental regeneration and more income, and drive more benefits down to communities as well, involve people in there, and therefore hopefully over time see more vibrant communities and bigger communities, bringing more people back. So that's really all I want to say, is just to run through that concept as an idea very quickly, and to state our belief that this is a good answer to everything that the uplands are now facing in Scotland.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alan. Yeah, I love how we've just seen three very different approaches, I think, different scopes of projects and fields of work, all looking at a very similar endeavour. So this is, again, a good opportunity to ask Alan. We are also 25 minutes from the end of the session, so we will be moving into a wider discussion pretty soon. But if anyone has questions directly for Alan right now about Trees for Life and the East-West Connect project, I've forgotten the exact name, sorry, Alan.
Close enough.
So there's a comment from Robert Mills, which I think we'll come back to in the wider discussion. Stephen Adlard is asking, what's the reason for the difference in income between Norway and Scotland? I know some journalists have gone into this in some detail. I wonder what you've found out.
A lot of it's about diversity of income streams in Norway. So they've got, through a more diverse landscape, they haven't just got a livestock income, for instance. They're working on, they might be berry picking, they might have a small forestry plantation selling firewood, different kind, probably more diverse food options. So yeah, it's the greater mix that's possible.
And you said that, well, you showed that a similar amount of funding is allocated by respective governments to those areas. What have you looked into what the structure of the Norway funding is that's so different?
I think I'm not sure about what, I don't know how the Norwegian subsidy works, or if they're specifically maintaining other incomes. It's just that the amount of money that a producer can count on is very similar to what the case is here.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Well, we've got some more comments coming in about subsidies. Does that mean the subsidies are going to the landowners from Norrie? And from Jane Cooper, being in an area that has focus on tourism, diversity is vital. Seeing the effect of COVID shutting down tourism. And I imagine that around Fort Augustus and that area, tourism is probably quite important.
Yeah, Fort Augustus in particular will be getting pretty smashed by COVID this year, and it's an easy one to look to in terms of sort of nature-based possibilities tourism. But I think it's really important that places have more identity than that and are producing their own hard goods.
I'm muted. Oh, great. So I'm going to loosen my tether on the conversation now and move into the final chapter of the session. So we've got 22 minutes left. And for the next 15 or so anyway, I'd like to just open the conversation to the floor much wider and just stimulating the conversation with the question, how can we overcome some of these cultural barriers to integrating land use? And perhaps Kay Brewster, who put in a lengthy comment just earlier about bringing evidence forward to the Scottish Government about agroforestry, and there was also Robert Mills bringing in a comment about what the running thread for him. So if you're willing, feel free to unmute yourself at any point and chuck yourself into this conversation. I can't see Kay Brewster in the conversation anymore. I was going to call on them, but they don't seem to be present. Okay.
I can say some things then, I guess.
Yeah, go for it, Robert. Please do.
I think it's very encouraging that central theme about building up community diversity in terms of income streams and resilience. It seems to run across these three talks. And I think it's very important. And it also came through with our conversation right at the outset about getting people back into the landscape and starting to value local production chains and local distribution chains as being part of the rural infrastructure. And I think a lot of the gaps to that are how land is owned and managed. And, you know, the comment I just made then about the difference between Norway and Scotland is very much to do with how land is inherited and can be purchased, and how it's owned and at what scale. And that's quite a key point when we consider some of the very large estates like Alan was alluding to earlier, that we find in Scotland. But also about valuing those rural goods. And Patrick talked about that in the context of, you know, the competition, if you like, between upland and lowland grazing. And it's about actually putting a societal value on those products. And perhaps we can learn a lot from some of our close European neighbours on how they value upland products, cheese, milk, meat, etc., and creating something which is of protected origin for some of those products. I think that's kind of a big part of this conversation for me anyway.
I think, Robert, not just to jump straight in on that, but I think it's not hard to disagree on some of the basics of what we're talking about here. We're talking about broadening portfolios. We're talking about integrating other land uses. We're talking about strengthening businesses to make them more resilient for the future. But I suppose I don't want to drag it back to my situation in Galloway, but I set up the Galloway Hills Network to help farmers do this, because at the moment they're facing some pretty binary choices. When you look at land, I'm trying to buy hill ground at the moment to graze cattle on. 5 years ago, the kind of ground I was looking at was about 800, 850 pounds an acre. Now it's over 3,000 pounds an acre, because it's all going into softwood forestry. A lot of farmers around here are very old. I worked out within 5 miles of where I am, there are 11 farmers, none of whom have any succession plan, and all of whom will be retiring in the next 10 years. That ground's going to go into forestry. It is just going to go into forestry. So when we, as much as I'm trying now to get people to broaden and think outside the box, so I do advisory work, and I was doing advisory work on a farm in Ayrshire. And I went up the hill and I said to the shepherd who came out with me, it wasn't the landowner, it was the shepherd. And I said, are there black grouse on the hill? And the shepherd said, I don't know. And I said, well, when did you last see a black grouse? And he said, I'm not sure that I would know one if I saw it. And part of me was like, that's not good enough anymore. You're a great stockman and you're running a really tight farm business here, but you've got to start looking at other interests, at other services that you can be providing. So to go back to my point, I think probably a lot of hill farming is going to vanish, particularly around here, because we're almost too late, and the change is almost too late to diversify. It's almost too late to strengthen your business. It's almost too late to put out an additional leg on your tripod. It's happening here. So that's why I'm always like, when I was asked to take part in this conversation, I thought I very rarely see Galloway and this kind of high pressure, massive land use being discussed, being expressed, being talked about. So I thought, fine, I'm maybe harping on too much about my corner here, but let this be a lesson to Scotland, well, north of England. When we talked earlier about the north of England and Scotland being, oh, well, we see it's northern uplands. You need planning permission to plant a single tree in Northumberland, and if you want to go to the Lake District to do even the smallest piece of planting, you need to jump through thousands of bureaucratic hoops. Here, if you want to do it, it'll happen tomorrow. So there is quite a difference wherever you look, and so just take this as a lesson. Take where we are as a lesson. Sorry, that's a long way around, but I hope it builds on what you were saying there, Robert.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I just wanted to say, I think the major barriers to making changes come from government, to be honest, and the government has been presented with lots and lots of evidence over the years. Andrew's Deer report is just one of the latest things. So, you know, it really has to be the government that through legislation, through changes in the way that the subsidies are provided, starts to make the change in the way that we change our uplands. The uplands are degraded, the soils are degraded, they're not producing what they should be producing. Lots of evidence from Frank Fraser-Darling in 1954 onwards has been presented to the government. we have to keep pushing, and we have to keep presenting that evidence again and again, and making sure that eventually the Scottish Government does take action. Because at the moment they tend to be producing more reports, setting up more groups, and putting off taking action, probably because of the pressure that's being put on them by the vested interests that currently are running most of our uplands. Yeah, I'd love to have some good ideas about how we actually make things happen in practice, because we've been stuck in this rut for such a long time. So we need something to start making that change.
Yeah, I agree with that, Helen, but I think that the practical idea to make that change is to be able to model, this is how you actually do it. So Andrew actually running an agroforestry business and being able to show the benefits of that. And similar experience with Lynn Breckcroft's another famous one. And all of these models can really point to what's possible. And I think I think we're getting past the stage where we can say that this kind of agenda is all just conceptual. It's all just wishing for a nice apple pie future. Here's how we can actually do this. And you guys need to get behind it, because your walk is completely different from your talk.
Elwyn and then William.
Well, I was just going to say that as long as the government offers subsidies in the areas that they do, and as a farmer in Angus, it's difficult to get off the conventional train. So I sort of somewhat take umbrage at the suggestion that the problem is farmers or landowners or whoever's getting the subsidies. The problem is the policies that the subsidies are supporting. And I do think there are farmers who are responsible, who want to be responsible for the nature and biodiversity for the community, but they feel constrained by the way that the policy pushes. And I have to say that I really enjoyed the video last night. Forget the name of the documentary about upland farming in Cumbria, because the fact is it's economically really difficult to do. It's a hard job to be a conscientious farmer. It's long, hard hours and not enough pay at the end of the day, despite the subsidies. So I think, as Helen said, it really does come down to government policy for me. And I'm not seeing at the moment that things are looking any more promising, but maybe other people know more than I do.
William, you have your hand up.
Can I offer?
Perhaps we can wait. We'll see if William has a chance to unmute themselves.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, I've spent most of the last couple of years traveling around getting educated at the age of 60-something. And I've seen a lot of farmers who've instigated change, and they've done it despite government. They've seen a need and they've gone for it. And I think if we wait for government to give us a lead, we'll still be waiting in 100 years' time. Big changes in most things come from the bottom up. And I think the rural community needs to get together and drive change for itself. And I think I now look at subsidy as a drug that the government is using to keep us under control and doing what they want and supporting their friends. And so I think the uplands have to come together to create our own future, hard as that is. And I don't deny it's very difficult, but I don't think we can expect government to look after us. And one of the great mantras that goes around in the States on change is that if you change how to do things, you'll only ever make small changes. Until you change how you see things, that's when you start really being open to change. We need to change how we see the uplands and open them up to diversity. And as a final thought, I have a neighbouring sheep farmer here, just in Angus, And his diversification is doing the lights for major rock shows. And that gives him the income to support his farming and enable him to revitalize his own little bit of rural community. And I can't think of any two more different businesses to be involved in than sheep farming and rock show, mega stadium light shows in Dubai. But that's the sort of uplands I would like to see in the future, that much diversity.
Helen, I see you had your hand up, but Andrew, I just want to check in if you still want to speak. And there's also a chat in there's some chat in the chat box. I'm wondering if Stephen would like to speak, and then Helen, I'll come to you.
I was just going to support the line that various folks, Helen was pointing out the current difficulties with government action. The only thing, and we probably all, or many of us, will have worked on the edge of government or interacted with government groups of one sort or another. But the one thing that does get action is when they're embarrassed into action by people pointing out the inconsistencies that exist in their actions and their policies. And with regard to the Galloway situation, it seems to me what's happening with much of forestry in southern Scotland goes against their wish for wider community involvement in land ownership. And we're offshoring, we don't know how much by, much of our ownership of land in Scotland through afforestation. That doesn't seem to me to sit well with government's stated aims with, on the community side in Scotland. So well-placed questions in Parliament, it's a political question. It's absolutely political. And those who want to get involved in that should feel free to do so at the organizational level or at the personal level. So I think it's a very important subject.
Just as a tag on to that, Andrew, when I said earlier my 1,600 acres surrounded by 35,000 acres, I've never met any of the 7 or 8 landowners who own those 35,000 acres, but I'm assured that 4 of them are Austrian. It's a query for me that if we've incentivized planting and made it so commercially viable that actually foreign investors are sinking money into it now, such that local landowners and young farmers trying to get into this can't. I quite agree. That kind of flies in the face of some of the narratives coming out of the government. And I wonder too, when the 4 of us spoke in preparation for this meeting a week ago, we touched very briefly, given that I'm always banging the same drum being from the south of Scotland, that there is a bit of a north-south split in Scotland. Having said earlier, there's an England, northern England, southern Scotland, northern Scotland. When we're talking about our northern uplands, we're talking about probably 3 roughly geographical areas. I think there's some really interesting stuff going on in the south of Scotland that I would love to see discussed. And if that, as you say, perhaps that's the mechanism that we get this properly chewed through is questions in Parliament start to actually go through some of this stuff, because at the moment it feels that it's not a stated aim. It's almost happening because nobody's spotted it. It's almost happening because nobody's really flagged it up or complained. So I don't know. That's the Austrian factor, I suppose, probably only really came to me 4 or 5 years ago, and I suddenly thought, what, why? Just throw that in. I was busy laboriously trying to type that out into a comment just now, so at least I've saved myself that by saying it.
Awesome, thanks, Patrick. So such a rich diversity of perspectives coming together here. I love it. Helen, you did have your hand up a moment ago, so I want to call on you again.
Yeah, I just think it's a nice idea that change should come from below. It's a lovely idea. But unfortunately in Scotland, you need resources to make change. You need land, you need money, and not many people have those resources in Scotland. We know how skewed land ownership is. And a lot of it being owned by overseas trusts, nameless trusts, overseas people. And the Scottish Government is well aware of all of that. These issues have been raised time and time again, and progress is incredibly slow. So although I think a lot can be done from below, an awful lot of the community work that's going on now has had some sort of seed core funding from government. and they needed it to get going. So yes, get communities, get people involved, but the government has to support that as well to make it happen, because everything resource ownership is so skewed in Scotland right now.
Yeah, so true. Helena, I just want to check in with you. Do we have any flexibility on the end time of this session?
You can carry on going for as long as you like.
Well, I just noticed that we're 5 minutes from the end, and that we might overrun by about 10 minutes if people are okay with hanging on for that long. Yeah, this question of political will versus grassroots will, I'm not sure if we'll ever get to the bottom of it. But I think I'd like to lead the conversation towards some practical steps in this kind of realm. But before we do so, I just want to, I've asked Stephen, who I know is a straight up forester, and keen agroforest as well, if you want to speak on something you wrote in the comments earlier.
Hi, thank you, Finn. I've really enjoyed all the talks, and especially the discussion they're just having now, and I 100% agree with the comments on land ownership and the politics of it all. But I do want to just flag up, and you know, Alan's talk I thought was excellent. I know he's come back at me in my comment there quite rightly, that a lot more could be done with developing broadleaf markets. But I do just want to say that, you know, if we're encouraging people to work on the land, change the ownership and so on, then actually we shouldn't discourage them from planting the most profitable crop up there in the uplands, which at the moment is Sitka spruce, because it yields well, it grows well, and it's got a ready market. And you know, that is, if you took away all the subsidies, that's probably what would be planted in a lot of these areas. If you know, I'm not saying we should blanket the whole of the uplands with Sitka by any means, but I don't want to discourage local landowners who have got areas that would be suitable for commercial crops to actually plant them, and them to be able to make a profit and for it to stay in the local community that way. Because I think it'd be fantastic if we could actually have native broadleaves and so on across much of the Highlands and with you know, Caledonian Scots pine forests and so on. But the difference in yield and the difference in access to markets for those products is huge. And so don't discourage local people from planting a profitable crop on their land. And it is, you know, the comment about the right tree in the right place. There are clearly some places where we shouldn't be planting commercial conifers, but there are certainly some areas where it's absolutely the right thing to do, and we should be looking with an open mind on those aspects.
Thanks, Stephen. Ellen, I'll let you respond in a moment. I just want to reflect on how this conversation is. I see very like two threads, of one of food and one of fiber, and obviously there's other kind of other threads going on, but these kind of two human, very like human needs being hotly contested in the uplands at the moment. And I think a lot of the conversation revolves around, well, how do we develop these chains of supply or webs of supply and demand in the uplands when there's so much potential for both, really, but the potential of either seems to be nowhere near being realized right now, and that seems to be some of the flavor that we're getting at here. So Alan, would you like to respond or comment additionally?
Comment, yeah, just to say, I agree we should be pragmatic about land use decisions and their profitability, to note all the uncertainty, but still to note the possibility that carbon offsetting funding could have a significant influence on what your most profitable planting options are if you've got a viable and relevant project there. And something else I've forgotten.
Okay, great. I just want to just chuck in there that I'm just want to send my apologies to Jane Cooper, who's been contributing beautiful comments in the chat, and I have forgotten that Jane doesn't have a working microphone, so that's why we've not heard her voice yet. And I realised as a facilitator I should have been giving you a voice, Jane, because you've been adding some great depth in the chat. So sorry I haven't been doing that, but hopefully everyone's been following that along the way. There's been a fantastic conversation, and I can see it going on for a long time, but we don't have a long time. So I just want to start wrapping it up, bring it towards a close. And I'd like to offer out an invitation to the speakers, or the panelists in particular, but also to anyone here, because the speakers, the panelists are not the only people holding expertise in the room by far. And just invite any closing comments and perhaps some key steps or practical actions that could be taken and that are a priority to take in the next few years to really start seriously, well, not start, but continue to seriously address some of the issues post-conference. So I'd invite any of the panelists to come forward first, and anyone else to come forward additionally.
I think what struck me most in the chat, Finn, was thinking about landowners and the calls for government to provide solutions to to drive change. And we're seeing some signs, in our work, that landowners are prepared to, especially people who are based here. Appreciate if you've got a foreign forestry investor in Austria, it's a different issue to connect with them, but people based here feel the breath of land reform on their necks, I think. Some of them do anyway. They feel the need to show that they are being responsible. This isn't everybody, but there's a significant number of conversations I've had in the last 18 months that I wouldn't have expected to have had 5 years ago. And that, therefore, my conclusion from that is there is possibility to identify some common cause and to slowly work with that kind of interest to model what that looks like. And that really could look like quite a different change. And that in itself makes it harder optically for those who don't get involved and don't get on board to sustain that sort of that non-involvement. This is my land and nobody's coming on it, and I don't care what you think. It also makes it, I think, easier for government to see what the practical solutions could look like and to support reform that could support that. So my need for optimism finds its home and its root in that to a large degree.
I would just go back to a point Alan and Andrew raised earlier about, or Alan raised about Andrew's presentation, was that this kind of what does it look like scenario. This Andrew's photographs were very helpful. We get to actually see agroforestry being actually delivered on the ground, and a lot of what I've been doing over the last 5-6 years has been based on kind of an agricultural equivalent. I've heard policy calling for more cattle in the hills, and so I've tried to make that happen, and I've tried to publish all sorts of case studies, all sorts of information, try to share lots of experiences about the many difficulties of restoring hill cattle and trying to get them hefted up onto the hill and trying to get them where you want them to go. And quite often there's a bit of a disconnect between SNH and Natural England saying we need cattle on the hill and then absolutely having no idea how to deliver that. And actually, I like to think I've generated some pretty useful stuff, particularly in a part of the country where hill cattle have been off pretty much since foot and mouth. It's a real challenge getting them back up there. So on one side, I think there's a real need for practical stories about how actually we deliver these changes. But at the same time, looking at bringing my cattle in off the hill in the next 10 days, comments coming out from the NBA about finishing cattle in 27 months or 28 months. Looking at my cattle as they come off the hill, they've had a cracking summer, but they're not going to get anywhere near 30 months ready for finishing. They'll be out on the hill back and forth for the next 4 or 5 years to get them where they ought to be. Fortunately, I'll be selling most of them on and people will be doing a lot of the legwork for me, but there's such a huge financial challenge that I can do quite a lot about the practical stuff, but I can't on my own meet the financial imperatives of a lot of this kind of work. And so there's this kind of disconnect that has always puzzled me, this kind of recognition that hill cattle bring huge environmental benefits. They have an economic argument. They have huge pride of local communities because everybody's got their own rare breed, their own native breed of cow, and there's a lot of story, a lot of stuff behind. We can do nothing but value that, and yet we don't value that. And so that's why I think probably any way forward has got to be make sure that the political, the funding, the financial arguments are already in place, but also not ignoring a lot of the stuff I've been doing the legwork on, which is the practicalities of, go on then, do it. And you should have seen the look on the face of my neighbours, probably none of whom are under the age of 70, when I put GPS satellite tags on my Galloways when they went out on the hill. They thought it was absolutely the most ridiculous thing that they'd ever seen. And then I was able to show them over the next few days on my phone, I was able to show where the cows were. And they said, well, that's quite handy. I bet that'll save you a lot of time. I was like, bloody right, it does save you a lot of time. There's so much space for innovation here. And that whole thing is a whole practical world of detail to be teased out. But without the financials there, it's such an uphill struggle. So maybe that's a bit of a note of optimism and a bit of pessimism to sign off on.
Thanks for those two closing remarks. If anyone else would like to step in now, I'm going to close the room at 10 past at the latest. So we've lost a few of the contributors along the way, unfortunately. Okay, well, if there's no more contributions, I'm very happy to close the room now. Just checking the chat for one last time. Yeah, I'll just close the room then. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining this conversation. It's been rich, it's been hearty. It was everything I wished for and more. So yeah, it's been really added to by everyone who's arrived, panelists included, but also everyone who's turned up today. So and actually I'm looking around, and I think I've heard or seen written almost everyone's voice in this conversation. So I've really enjoyed the back and forth aspect and how we've got a very rounded perspective. I don't know, one of the aims of the session was to thrash out a sort of vision for the uplands, and we didn't do that in the sense of a vision going forward that we might all work together on, but I certainly feel like I have a greater shared understanding of a vision for what is possible in the uplands, and a couple of the optimistic mechanisms of doing it, although some strong notes of pessimism throughout cannot be ignored. That it's difficult work, and it's not structurally supported, and it might take a lot of innovation, entrepreneurship, and perhaps a little bit of devilry to make change happen that we want to happen. So with that, thank you everyone for turning up. Thank you to the speakers for contributing your time in particular. It's been a real joy to hold this space, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of Northern Real Farming Conference.